Nicholas Bornels of Capital Inc. I'd like to welcome you to the second panel of today's forum. And this panel is on global economy and shipping, a symbiotic relationship facing new geopolitical challenges. So shipping grows as the global economy grows, and at the same time, shipping is helping the global economy to grow further, being a critical link in the global supply chain. And right now, shipping and the global economy are facing new challenges given the geopolitical situation. So we have a great panel with us of major industry participants. I'd like to thank them all for joining, and I will turn it over to John Benson, partner from Watson Farley Williams, to introduce our panelists and to kick off the panel. Thank you to everybody for joining. And you're joining from all over the world, which shows exactly the global nature of shipping and what technology allows us to do today.
Great, Nicholas, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me to moderate this panel. It's a distinguished group and no small topic to try to bite off today. But let's jump in. With me today are Mark O'Neill, President, Columbia Shipmanagement, President, InterManager, Mr. Gary Vogel, CEO, Eagle Bulk, Mr. Ted Petrone's on the line, Vice Chairman of Navios Corporation. We also have Mr. Marco Fiori, CEO, Premuda, and finally joining us, Mark Darley, Marine and Offshore Director at Lloyds. So it's not a small topic, gentlemen, we know that, and there's a lot of angles to come at this from. There are specific panels we've seen on specific current events, and they can deal with that. But my thought was, let's jump off from on high and zero in as we go. Geopolitical, broadly defined, is relating to politics, especially international relations, as influenced by geographical factors. So basically everything, right? So, well, we have something like a pandemic, which in and of itself may not be geopolitical. The various responses, of course, are, and we've seen over the last 2 years how those responses can have impact on systems, which, when they're working well, we take for granted. But at the end of the day, can be very fragile. Front and center, the impact of the pandemic on seafarers. That's just an example. There's obviously no shortage: civil unrest, trade disputes, policies, increasing regulation. All of this is weighing. I'd be very interested to hear from each of you, which of those that I've mentioned or maybe didn't mention has had the biggest impact in the last few years. I suspect pandemic, it might be otherwise, but really, what's really weighing on the way owners and operators conduct their business today and prepare it for tomorrow? What's front and center at the moment? And only because I have a very special affinity for Mark as O'Neill as a reformed lawyer, and I'm very jealous of his role. Mark, may I start with you?
Oh, thanks, John. Thanks very much for that, and thank you for having me and all of us on this panel. It's always an interesting debate. I think in sort of preparing for this, I thought as a back to those cases, the case law, particularly English case law, dating back to the sort of 16 and 1700s, which referred to, first of all, they were all shipping law cases, and they referred to the maritime adventure. And shipping was called the maritime adventure because pretty much everything that can go wrong is somehow in the mix, be it weather, be it construction, be it trade, and be it the relations between states. So I don't think today is any different from what it was all those years ago when one looks at the case law. I think when one looks at what was the greatest impact, what does impact mean? I think impact is a product of surprise, scale, and the ability to deal with a particular circumstance when one considers the impact of a particular event. And I think I'm probably in common with all of the others that the pandemic has to be the biggest impact. It's changed pretty much everything in our own social and personal lives and in our business lives. It's changed international business, probably forever. It's changed the location of international business, as you know, the previous move towards globalization has seen the sort of the tentacles of globalization retreat. It's changed trade flows. I mean, you only have to look at the LNG trade flow anticipated now and the changes to that, and as we all scrabble to reposition ourselves. And I think it's changed also the appetite of individuals and countries for that business. So I think the other geopolitical events that you referred to in your introduction, you can pretty much see coming. There's going to be wars, there's going to be recessions, there's going to be shortages of one thing or another. But I think what makes this pandemic so unique is its global reach and its ability to reinvent itself and its characteristics and the consequences associated with the pandemic. So just when you think you've got it nailed, just when you think you've got a modus operandi in place to deal with it, it reinvents itself. So I think the pandemic sits somewhere between Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And that's what makes the impact of it so massive for our industry and for the world.
Sorry, I have a slow mute trigger finger. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think it's highlighted the ability of some to respond and really magnified those who may have been flat-footed. Maybe Gary, can I look to you? Is it the biggest driver, the biggest influence right now? Obviously, the pandemic, and what do you see as sort of forming positions going forward?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thanks for having me. I absolutely agree with Mark. If you look at the pandemic, it just has really touched almost every facet of business that we deal with, and personal life, and the way you interact, and technology. You know, you imagine if we went through that 25 years ago, the lack of technology that really enabled us to do so much that we couldn't have done then, and we're fortunate, of course, for that. You know, having said that, you know, these disruptions are almost a continuum. You know, I've rattled them off so many times over the last number of years. You know, it's by rote. You know, in the bulk market, Vale dam collapse, Asian swine flu, trade war, you know, tariffs on U.S. soybeans. I mean, it goes on, and then of course came COVID, collapse in crude, and so they just, you know, again, to Mark's point, you know, these are the expected unexpecteds, and it's really about being in a position to deal with them, right? And some you know, help shipping. Disruption is often positive for shipping. By definition, people find the most efficient trade routes and means for moving product, and when that gets disrupted, it's often helpful for things like ton mile, until you get, of course, to demand destruction. But it's really about dealing with them, you know, better than the majority. And I think to that point, it's about being prepared for the unknown. And you mentioned in your opening remark, you know, taking things for granted. I think the crewing crisis is a good example of that, right? The way we rotated crews, we didn't really think twice about it. It just worked. And then we saw the fragility of it over the last few years. So it's really trying to ask yourself, you know, in terms of the unknown, and of course, if it was known, it'd be a different discussion. But in terms of those unknowns, how do you position your company to deal with them best possible, whatever it might be that comes down the pipe?
Yeah, almost in some ways, you know, lessons learned and were they well learned. To that end, maybe Ted, if I could turn to you, do you share the view, you know, that is the impact of the pandemic is permanent? I think we do, but and how is that informing sort of the view and the way owners are sort of looking towards potential for other disruptive events like that, as it might be different than the way they looked at it 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. Again, apologies for, and our Zoom camera doesn't seem to work, but here I am, all dressed up and nowhere to go. You know, let's start at 50,000 feet here and talk about it. You call it geopolitical events, but it's really black swan events. And some of them, there's a hint that they're coming, but most of the time you don't see them coming, right? And they affect different segments differently. They originate outside of shipping, as Gary was saying, but they affect us dramatically, going back to 9/11 and Lehman Brothers and the commodity collapse, and as Gary said, the swine flu. All these things you have to be prepared for. For example, look what COVID did. It was a boon for the tankers and then a bust. It was a bust for the containers. And now, because of the fiscal and monetary policy that followed that, which is geopolitical issues, it really has been a boon for containers, right? Because it's got the Western consumers buying more goods than services. It has been terrible on transportation for the tankers because no one was traveling, they were buying more goods. And you know, what's interesting about Navios is just to say how we look at it. We took last year and kind of reimagined shipping. And so we had the right platform in place now, we think, because we were in 3 different segments, right? We're doing 15 type of vessels. We're going to 10 different end users. And so we have an ability to smooth out the risk profiles, you know, have stable returns, because those segments are anti-cyclical. There's a negative correlation between the wet and the dry, which is exactly what you want. So our opinion has been, you don't see black swans coming. They have events which you're unsure of. I mean, just look at the sanctions. The sanctions we did with Iran were sanctions on cargo. Now we're sanctioning people and institutions and cash remittances. Very different. So we have a whole team on getting involved in that. But you have to have the ship prepared before the storm. And as Gary said, they're coming quicker and faster these days. So we're very happy. We think our model actually fits the current macroeconomic and political environment.
No, and this is sort of a theme as we look into this black swan events, and you know, you can't know what you don't know. Maybe Marco, to that theme, how are owners thinking about these things differently than they may have just, you know, in recent memory, accepting the fact that you can't be prepared for everything? But do we need to think differently about what sort of systems and approaches we need to have to enable us to, as Ted said, you know, I think very directly, reimagine shipping, reimagine what we do?
You know, I think also that, thank you, John. Hello, good morning to everybody. Good afternoon to people in Europe. I think Mark and Ted and Gary, they're all extremely right in what they said, because, you know, I think also one other effect of the pandemic, I was reading something last night in a book, and I think they had a good quote. It says, amateurs talk tactics while professionals study logistics. I think what was forgotten in all this crisis, I think a little bit, everybody, especially the people on the street, they were imagining that products were arriving at IKEA. They were just transported there by truck the night before. I think this gave a huge understanding to everybody about the complex world of logistics, or where things come from where, the long chains of transportation. I don't think that a lot of people, unless the people in shipping had realized all of that. You know, people think that things just materialize, the oil, the gasoline is extracted from the ground as gasoline, you know. So I think this gave a lot of perspective. I tend to agree that this is going to be a little bit a hit on the concept of globalization, because I think people will be rethinking about shortening the lines of logistics, because nobody wants to be again in this kind of situation. But going back to the fact about what can we do as seen by owners, you know, by definition, owners tend to be, or have to be, if they're surviving, have to be very flexible and to adapt to the market conditions. And in shipping, there is always something going wrong. You know, there's more often than not, there's always something going wrong. So you have to be ready to see what's happening and adjust to those things. And I think it's always a constant path of learning, adapting, changing for the future. and then you start again learning because something else. Look, this what happened about Ukraine, and this happened a few months after that we had COVID, and we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And it's really typical saying, like, you know, it's a train coming the other direction. You know, at the moment you think you're out of it, there's something, another break is here. And for the tankers, for dry cargo, it is a big problem, all of this, on the sanctions, how to navigate through them, providing, especially in Europe. Europe is very dependent on energy from these countries. So it's going to be very complicated how to adapt in Europe on these changes.
Marco, I couldn't agree with you more that we have globally, I think, a much more nuanced and enhanced understanding of the complex world of trade. You know, when I have, you know, just the average person on the street talking to me about intermodal pressures and trade that didn't know what that meant 20 months ago.
Yeah, it's nuclear science for a lot of people. So it's been a very steep learning curve, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, to that, Mark Darley, maybe if with that nuanced understanding, and we've seen this impact, you know, you're uniquely positioned. Where are you seeing or anticipating the long-term impacts, whether that be on trade flows or other habits of operators in this space?
Yeah, thanks, John, and morning, everybody. Again, it's great to be on this panel with everybody this morning. We're just picking up on a few of the comments from my fellow panelists this morning. I think, you know, everybody's absolutely spot on. I think previously in maritime, we used to talk about flexibility, and flexibility is about planning for events that you can see ahead of you. But increasingly, we're talking about adaptability because the world is becoming more disruptive. Things are happening that we couldn't imagine years ago, and that's had and will continue to have a huge impact, not only in the near term in what we're seeing. I think it was Gary that mentioned, you know, we've seen near-term spikes in ton miles. You've only got to look at sort of the energy commodity prices and how they've sort of spiked over the last couple of weeks, and then more recently conversations that we're having in particular segments about demand now needed in LNG vessels to be built, various other trades. That's very sort of a near-term view. But as much as we talk about the challenges, I think, of the pandemic, I think if you stand back and 50,000-foot view, you know, there's a lot of positives that have come out of the pandemic from a maritime perspective. And I think maritime's fared pretty well in terms of its resilience and its ability to adapt, be flexible as well, and deal with the cards that it had in front of it through the pandemic. But also, I think there's some real sort of positive disruptors that have also accelerated through the pandemic. I mean, you've only got to look at how now we are talking and using data and analytics within maritime, an industry that was probably one of, if not the last sector to really adopt data and digitalization. I don't think we're there yet in terms of our use in data and digitalization, but you know, if you look at the last 12 months, the amount of shipshore data that is being transferred has trebled in the last 12 months alone. And yes, you know, that there's data in terms of crew communicating to their families ashore, but there's also that data being used with charterers and end cargo owners, importantly, to be able to make commercial decisions about the ships that they are using today. And really, that is just going to extrapolate. And as an industry and as ship owners, shipbuilders, companies like our own, understanding how we can maximize the use of that data really will facilitate the transition, but also facilitate some of the an increase in terms of you know, where and what ships we charter around the world. And just come back to Marco's point as well. You know, I couldn't agree more. In my country, we're talking about an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis. And we always knew going into decarbonisation that the future fuels that we were talking about, the ammonias, the hydrogens, the methanols, the biofuels, we knew within maritime that these fuels would be anywhere between 4 to 6 times more expensive. But we were almost embarrassed to tell the rest of the industry as we were developing the technology and the conversation internally within maritime. Now, as Marco says, everybody understands the importance of maritime and where they're getting their cargo, where they're getting their fuel. And therefore, what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the cost of living crisis, I think is almost like a precursor to what the average person in the street can expect. But it has helped to raise the understanding of just how important maritime is in that global supply chain.
No, it's an interesting theme we're picking up. It really is putting our industry sort of front and center for a lot of folks, and people realizing that it informs so much more than they realize on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day, year-to-year basis. One thing that's mentioned a bit here has been technology, and that's something that I keep coming to as I was thinking about this panel. And I wanted to think about what distinguishes. So, accepting the fact that I think we all agree that pandemics changed the way we think about things, forever. That's not coming back. And there have been positive disruptors and sort of changes that have been adopted and are sort of the part of our new paradigm that are really going to be drivers for positive change within just the way we operate and the business and the economics of what we do. But to that end, what distinguishes a participant from being able to really pivot and take advantage and respond to these things in a positive way and adopt good habits, and those who are just simply maybe flat-footed and not? Is it a large and robust platform? Is that critical these days with access to cutting-edge technology and things that can help them take advantage of optimization and the usual digitalization that we're thinking about? I don't know, maybe Mark O'Neill, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think John, a lot of that must be right, but I think to enable a business organization to roll with the punches and take these sort of geopolitical impact events, not in its stride, but cope with them. I think it's really, really important to be, and we've heard these words already, be nimble, flexible, dynamic operationally and management-wise, and be very fast in decision-making. And, I think those organizations that have those qualities have, as a start point, coped better with the latest geopolitical events, including COVID, than those that aren't. The next thing is, I think one needs to be prepared. And, whether it was Sun Tzu or Machiavelli, or I forget, but, in times of peace, prepare for war. I think, again, those that forgot that and went into this COVID pandemic over-leveraged, overextended, and with insufficient liquidity, will find themselves in problems, having problems, and particularly where they don't exhibit the sort of qualities that I just talked about in relation to the management. I think organizations that have not put all of their eggs in one basket, so have spread the risk between sectors and between vessel types and industries they're in, clearly that minimizes the risk too. And I think alongside technology, which clearly has helped, I think those organizations that have long and medium term invested in their people are the organizations that have come through this the best. Before COVID, all the talk was about digitalization and technology. After COVID, or should I say during COVID, and as we come to the tail of COVID, the conversation has switched completely. It's all about people. If you have a great team, if you have great people, if you invest in your people, motivate them, properly reward them, train them on board and ashore, your people can pretty much deal with anything. And I think, as we criticize ourselves for many things within this industry, but actually, as a bunch of people, as a bunch of teams, we're pretty good. And we've been able to take this COVID pandemic, for the most part, in our stride, and certainly better than other industry and other industry sectors. So I think technology and digitalization is important. It remains vitally important. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution, but only as far as it enhances our people to do the things that people do and better. And I think that's the sea change that has come in. It's not all about digitalization. It's not all about technology. It's about the really simple fact people, all of us. And that's really, really important. I think finally, leadership. I think those organizations that have demonstrated leadership externally and internally have fared better than those that haven't. And leadership is from the bottom up and the top down. You know, it's at all levels. And I don't just mean the sort of CEO level, I mean throughout levels. So I think in our experience, those are the qualities that enable organizations to get through the COVID pandemic and other crises in the best way possible.
Thanks. Maybe Gary, if I could turn to you. You know, what would you view? You know, to Mark's point, technology is important. People are essential, and you know, obviously, leadership makes all the difference. As far as an organization's DNA, what do you think is among the most important attributes to respond and react to these unknowns at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them listed are just a given, right? Strong systems, processes, strong governance is helpful to how you deal with things in a methodical way, and that again, it goes to process. But I think, you know, people are absolutely in mindset. You know, our business model is an active owner operator, right? So by the nature of that spot trading mentality, right, we address the market in a matter of, you know, hours, not weeks, months, or years. And so, you know, when, for instance, China changes its quarantine requirement to 56 days for a ship about to go into dry dock, we don't sit there and go, well, this ship is coming, you know, is coming off a one-year charter, or we've already told the charter we're going to dry dock. What do? We pivot for a 20-day voyage to a place that's not quarantined, but that's what we do every day, right? And so this mindset of how do we engage, how do we maximize value? You know, there are these kinds of requirements, and I'll go back to, you know, the quarantine for dry dock, right? They're painful. Nobody can avoid them all, right? But it's about avoiding those potholes and having the people that are there to engage and say, how do I mitigate the downside and maximize the upside here? And are there opportunities because other organizations aren't dealing with it as effectively, right? To take on those things. So absolutely, I think mindset's important. You know, we talk about these, you know, the unknown knowns, you know, things are coming. You know, I look back at our company, and I think a good example, and no question, being in different segments has certain diversification advantages. We could spend hours talking about that, but there are ways to mitigate downside risk, many ways in which companies can do that. One way I like to talk about is December of 2019, we were extremely constructive on the markets, had just installed scrubbers on the vast majority of our fleet. Everything was looking really good. And yet we had unencumbered assets because nobody knows what tomorrow brings. And when COVID hit, although it was short-lived at the time, dry bulk rates dropped pretty precipitously. Nobody knew how long that would be. Nobody had been through anything remotely like the pandemic. And it enabled us to put bank debt onto these ships, you know, not expensive, dilutive, you know, capital raise, things like that. And ultimately, we didn't need that capital, but it changed the calculus and the discussions around things like runway calculations, which, you know, I thought we had put to bed in 2016 in dry bulk, right? But then again, those discussions. So it's about, you know, being humble enough to know we don't know what's coming, and put yourself in a position to deal with those unknowns as best possible. And I think that's really an important part, as best possible, because nobody here on the panel or anyone can sit there and go, we've got this thing covered, because that's the nature of these unknown geopolitical events. And so it's about putting yourself in a position to succeed as much as you can.
That's interesting point, Gary. And you know, to Mark's initial point, the technology and the digitalization is front and center. And you know, to steal a phrase, it's an evolution, not revolution. And to your point, that pivot, yeah.
Sorry. I'd like to get in on that question.
Yeah.
It's okay. So we're all going to answer this question similarly in different ways. But I think the pandemic, there were a lot of mega trends in place. This has just advanced these trends and sped them up, and it sped up a lot of things. Now, to quote Warren Buffett, winners adapt. And we have some owners here on this panel that are adapting. But the thing about a prudent owner, ship owner, whatever segment you're in, you have to control two things. That's what you can control. That's it. Risk and cost. And so we're talking about risk here. And I absolutely agree with Mark, what he said before. It's people. We have to have the right team, the seasoned team, disciplined team that understands more than shipping. They got to know the broader economic landscape. They have to understand the end users, the services the industries we service, these political trends that may lead toward environmental issues with propulsion. The interesting thing about Navios and those of us on the ownership side, once you've been through the end of the world once or twice, the next time's not so bad. But you learn from the end of the world and you go forward. And again, I just come back to what we decided to do last year when we transformed the partners into a diversified platform to dampen the market volatility, right? Give us cross-segment opportunities and to be able to pivot if there is a pandemic or China stops importing coal, Indonesia stops exporting coal, OPEC slows down. There's a number of things we can be done because we have the other segments. And, it gives us a flexibility in our operational and financial and commercial decision-making process, not to have the pressure of high leverage because you're getting in money elsewhere. Again, a tested risk management platform for pre-fixing with vetting and all those issues are extremely important. But again, it starts with leadership and it starts with people, and that's what shipping is all about. You're absolutely right, Mark.
No, it's interesting and not surprising that it's, there are all these systems and infrastructures, whether it be a risk management platform, a really robust digital platform working towards optimization. But, to use Gary's example about the long quarantine and pivoting to a 20-day voyage on that, there's no algorithm that's going to just do that for you. You have to have a good team and you have to have people actively working hard. Marco, maybe I can turn to you. What do you see as the critical elements of an organization's DNA to take these disruptions and put themselves in the best position to turn them into positive disruptions?
I think that one of the main things, like Mark said, is people. Because I'm still very much of a people believer, and people have to be motivated. And strangely enough, if you look at any balance sheet of any company in the world, the most important thing does not show on your balance sheet, which is one of your most important assets, which is people. It's something that's not there. So I think it's one of the most underrated things that you can have. Second, I think also if each crisis is different, I think you have to experience plays a little bit of a role, because there is always a leading theme of things happening. The boom of the tanker market at the beginning of COVID with a lot of floating storage was very similar to what happened in 2017, 15 actually. So, you saw it coming a little bit, different developments, but at the end of the day, it's the same results. So I think people, systems are also very important because they allow you to operate also in harsher conditions. You can still keep a hands-on management. But when I also say people, I'm not thinking only the people in the office, also the people that are on board of ships. It is so important what they do, what they don't do. And in this COVID crisis, I must say that a lot of them have been playing a pivotal role, accepting to have longer periods on board, a lot of things that really kept the world going, just for a lot of sense of responsibility. And I think it was nice to see that there was people out there who understood the difficulty of the situation, so that I go back to the people issue.
No, and Marco, I think that touches on a point that you learn a lot about the people you work with and you work alongside in times like these. Being mindful of the time, we've talked about the unknown and reacting to the unknown. there are other things on the horizon that are known, decarbonization comes to mind. Obviously, we know there are requirements, there are events on the horizon and milestones that we're going to need to be meeting. These aren't going to sneak up on us, but at the end of the day, you also can't just the day before a milestone requirement flip a switch and say, here we are. So maybe Mark, Darley, I think you're uniquely positioned to maybe share some thoughts on this. What's been the biggest impact of these current and oncoming requirements, and how is that sort of going to change our future behaviors and demands in the market, whether it be current fleet, new build? Where's the biggest impact going to be there?
Yeah, sure. I think the pandemic was very interesting from that perspective as well. Look, I think as an industry in general, we're very reactive, and we're very used to being told what to do by when. You look at all the regulations that we've had in the past until we got to the Sulfur 2020 regulation, and then we had two choices. And look how much conversation, deliberation, money went into just those two choices. And here we are now staring down the decarbonisation regulation framework, and it's a multitude of choices. And I think that's where we are as an industry is struggling, trying to understand, what that multitude of choices means for us within different segments, different operators, different trade routes. And I think the pandemic gave people time to sort of sit back in their living rooms, their home offices, and reflect a bit about what was happening. But now, of course, the world's got very busy again. We've gone back to flexible ways of working. We've got other geopolitical forces now happening in the world, and to be honest, that coupled with where shipyards are, now full until 24, 25, has led to another almost pausing of the acceleration and the trajectory as we try and get towards those 2030 and 2050 goals of decarbonisation. My hope is that, with everything that we're seeing in the world, that we as an industry continue to collaborate. There are sort of signs that regulation, rather than coming together, is starting to diverge. Look at how the EU, how the UK, my country, are taking their own approaches in terms of charging for carbon credits or greenhouse gas emissions in certain territories. And personally, as an organisation, we don't think that's the way to go. We've got to invest a huge amount of money in making sure that as an industry we get decarbonisation right, and we achieve the goals that have been laid out. That requires us to collaborate. It also, though, requires us to make sure that we have a mechanism in place that can use all that cash to support the research and development that's needed for the benefit of the whole industry, not just those people that have made some good money over the last couple of years and can invest in technology and invest in the conversation. Because if we're going to achieve the goal, it requires the whole industry to come together to achieve those goals.
I think it's universally accepted that it's a massive undertaking and absolutely will require collaboration, and there's no go it alone approach there. Gary, maybe to you on that decarbonization point, where do you see that collaboration happening, and where's the movement happening at the moment?
I think I've been really encouraged by the collaboration in the industry. There's so many examples, and we're active members, and I think it's important to say active, not just signatories to to a number of them, including Getting to Zero, Sea Cargo Charter, and many more, because this, it's really important to try and speak with a unified voice. Mark spoke about, the localized regulation. It just increases cost. It'll delay the ability for ship owners to invest with any amount of certainty at the time when we can do that. And because of it, again, well-intentioned, understand we're all trying to get to the same place. But it really makes things very difficult when you don't know what that landscape is and how it can change, again, back to politics, change, on a political whim, if you will. So, I think there can't be enough collaboration, and that the industry really needs to do whatever it can to speak with a unified voice to make sure that we have an important seat at the table, not just one at the kids' table. Because we really need to be able to help move that conversation in a way that we can invest. And the carbon pricing as an example, right? If those funds just disappear into the coffers of local government, as opposed to be coming back to help to solve the huge challenge ahead, which whether it's the technological challenge, the pricing disparity of zero emission fuels, or the supply chain. The fuel supply chain is such a huge one as well. It's just going to delay the impact, which is not what anybody wants. So I absolutely think that the more we can collaborate on this, it's never been so important in shipping. But I am encouraged by the amount of discussion going on.
Gary, can I add one thing? But I think another thing that we should all have is realistic expectations. I think sometimes people have totally unrealistic expectation that this transition to a carbon-free economy can be done in few years, and instead will take time. It's inevitable. It has big changes and will take time. And I think nobody, like I have seen, likes to have lines of supply chains broken, because they've seen the extent of the damage it can do. So I'm not saying not to adapt, but let's have some realistic expectations. There's nothing worse than having unrealistic expectations. All of this, the price of oil going up, is all, most of it, in my opinion, is based on a realistic expectation that oil was out and carbon-free was in. And guess what? People still need oil to use their car, the transportation, the delivery of their packages, the airplanes they take. And I think people has been living a little bit in a dreamland of saying, let's be very fair, let's be very strict, and let's be realistic. I think reality is very important in these debates.
Marco, I agree with you 100% as usual. I think there's a consensus in the industry that nobody's talking about, and the consensus is ships are going to have to slow down starting next year. I mean, you need not only a single leap, you need a double leap in technology to push these big ships through the water. I mean, talk about ammonia or hydrogen, even the tank space you need is 50 to 100% more. It just makes sense that, listen, LNG is only 30% less pollutant than diesel. So where are we going here by doing LNG? It's not really the interim answer. I'm not sure why the container guys have done this. I think the reason you see a lot of less ordering, certainly there's been a rationalization in the shipyards. They're about 60% down from 10 years ago. But the issue is you got an asset that you want to make, over a 20-year period that maybe is not going to be good in 5 years. You're going to have to redo the engine. So actually, we've been safe from ourselves. This IMO regulation has stopped ordering, certainly on the dry and the tanker side. Oh. And I think that's good for shipping. But in terms of technology, we're years away from anything that can push the ship through the water that's not comes from oil right
Absolutely. Now. I totally agree. So you have to be realistic, and people sometimes lose, they need a reality check.
As we say in the States, it's the white elephant in the room nobody's talking about.
The 20,000 pounds elephant in the room.
Yeah, it's an interesting point in an industry that has historically been generally fragmented. That it seems a consensus that a unified voice here is going to be critical to the path forward, and that path forward is going to have to be realistic and understand that this isn't a goal and you don't flip a switch. Marco, Neil, where do you see the progress happening now and the opportunity for further in the near term?
Thanks, John. I mean, I was listening to Gary's comments with interest, and yes, there has been a lot of collaboration and discussion internally, but there hasn't been a lot of unified product externally. I think a unified voice would help a lot. I've said in the past that at the moment we haven't got a single voice. We haven't even got a common language in shipping. And I think we are such intensely competitive and capitalistic organizations that there is a huge amount of self-interest across the sectors and within the sectors, and that detracts from this this common voice. I think if we all started the alphabet with 5-second intervals, you would get the sort of net effect that we have in shipping. It would be just complete distortion. And I think all of this debate internally within our sector is similar to that. All of us starting A, B, C, D with 5-second intervals, and you would pretty soon lose track of what you're hearing. We then we send that message, that distorted message, into organizations that are ill-equipped and ill-suited, not founded to act as the voice piece of the shipping sector, such as the IMO, which is a legislative body, not a lobbying body, and it goes precisely nowhere. It gets lost in the bureaucracy. So I do think that unless we actually get ourselves together, we have a debate in advance of this regulation and legislation, and decide with one voice where we want to go on the macro issues and deliver that voice to the correct recipient, then we're going to be swallowed up by the bigger logistics sector without so much as even a burp, and we will lose our very unique position in that logistics sector, which we've had and we've been privileged to have over the last few hundred years. So I think the challenge is there. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think we need that one voice.
Yeah.
You know, as the industry stands today, just one short thing, in my opinion, the probability to get a consensus voice or vote from our industry is the same as getting a consensus vote out of the UN. It's just not going to happen, Jim.
Well, the airline industry does it. Other industries do it, and I think if we go into it with that approach, we won't get it done. I think we have to go into it with an open mindset on macro issues. Those are the issues which apply across sectors. We can certainly find agreement, and certainly on the more micro issues that are sector specific, no, and nor should we. But on big macro issues such as decarbonisation and propulsion, etc., we should be able to come up with a single in advance of the legislative fora that are occurring, so that we can actually deliver a unified opinion on it. But at the moment, we don't have that. And
Mark, agree with you, but two problems that I see. One is that it is more of a fraction the industry than the airlines. In airlines, you have very big players and very few small players. And the second thing is that in the airlines, you don't have a quarter of the egos of all these players that are playing in shipping. So I think that's totally
good job. We haven't got the egos, right, Marco?
Forgive me. It's a lively discussion. I hate to interrupt, but we need to bring this to a close. Regrettably, I'm so sorry to interject because the other panel is already starting right now. So. What an amazing discussion. Really tremendous thanks to everybody. I wish we could go on for hours.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Been a pleasure.
Flight, Mark.